Hi, Graham. Good afternoon.
Hi, how's it going?
Very well. How are you?
Good. Not too bad.
Good. I'm sorry, I'm gonna stay off camera because it's
That's
quite
okay.
in the morning today. Cool.
I understand.
I'm also recording the session, if you don't mind, just for
That's fine.
note-taking purposes and sharing purposes.
Sure.
Cool. So the reason we scheduled this was primarily a discussion you had with Song about namespaces and clusters. So I would like you to explain a bit how we do things currently, and in my understanding, some enhancement.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the what I was kind of talking about or alluding to was just the way. So with the way we currently do like what we call the GitLab managed apps part. So the part where you can attach Kubernetes cluster to GitLab either at a project level or at the group level.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you do that currently in the application, on the cluster settings itself, you're given a list of applications you can install. You can install Helm, you can install Cert Manager, and there's like 5 or 6 things there. It
Mm-hmm.
all makes sense. And obviously there's limitations with the way that works at the moment because it's all done from, I think the Rails app itself actually does the kubectl calls and everything. So they're moving that to having all of the GitLab managed apps done by CI jobs, which
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely for. And I think that makes perfect sense. And the tooling and what they've done so far looks good. The problem is when they moved it to doing it via GitLab CI, the way you kind of differentiate different clusters or anything
Mm-hmm.
got changed a little bit, I guess you could say. So before, when I added a GitLab cluster to a group, sorry, when I added a Kubernetes cluster to a GitLab group,
Mm-hmm.
on that cluster screen, I could choose the apps I wanted to install and I could choose the settings. I could say, I want to install these apps or I want to set up this to configure such a way. But it was on the settings screens for the cluster. It didn't matter, let's say at the group level, it didn't matter which projects were using that cluster. It didn't matter what environment scopes, like GitLab environment scopes were being used. It was just for the setting page was on that cluster and related to that cluster.
Yes.
So with the CI approach, that kind of becomes a little bit blurry because our example is for GitLab.com is we want to have, say, 5 or 6 Kubernetes clusters, and they may have different purposes. One might run all our staging, one might run all our production,
Mm-hmm.
and that workflow aligns with the environment scope, production, staging, what have you. But then there's also times we want to have a Kubernetes cluster that is running production workloads, but is a different cluster maybe for some specific projects or for security reasons. So we're doing things like with Vault, HashiCorp Vault for security and things like that.
How do
So
you?
I guess what
Sorry,
that means,
you
sorry.
said, you said it's a different cluster. It's still on a group level, but
Yeah.
how is it different? You mean?
So they're actually different Kubernetes clusters so that we might spin up like 3 or 4 different actual Kubernetes clusters.
Okay, I see what you mean.
And so to us, say 3 of those might actually be part of production,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the model where with GitLab CI, we're aligning to the GitLab environment scope model, where you have like, the environment scope production, or you could have like staging
And
or
you have one
star.
cluster per environment scope.
Yes. But so the problem was environment scopes for GitLab don't necessarily map to me a particular one cluster. So the current model, I can add the cluster, I can go to the app screen, I can click the install buttons on that cluster and I know it's that cluster.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with the new model, it's per environment scope, like a CI job runs per environment, or it's
Right.
tied to an environment, but an environment to me is not a single cluster. And so there's actually no way for me to say, these are 3 Kubernetes clusters, one running one app in production, one running another app in production, and one is running this extra security app that has extra compliance reasons. So
Mm-hmm.
I need them in separate clusters, but to me, they're all production. And I can't manage the apps for those independently or like before where I could go to the screen for that cluster. I knew exactly what I was doing. With the
Mm-hmm.
environment scope thing, it's really tricky that there's that diluted sense of, I don't really know where I'm running the CI job, what cluster I'm actually configuring. And it becomes a lot difficult to manage.
So I understand the use case that you have multiple clusters per environment, and that was the reason I scheduled the meeting with you, because I think it's probably a more technical reason we decided to. In my understanding, we only allow one cluster per environment, because otherwise GitLab wouldn't know, at least on a project level or even group level, which cluster to deploy to. If it's not defined in the .yaml file, because I guess you can define which cluster you're going to use. Is that?
It depends on how, I guess it's how the cluster management project is configured at the moment, because there's that functionality that's in alpha, which is called the cluster management project,
Yes.
which I've been trying to utilize. But yeah, what happens is if I have, let's say, 3 clusters, and each one of those is set to use the one cluster management repo, because I would like one repo to manage all my clusters. I can't get it to actually run against all 3 of my clusters, because, you know, there's only one per environment.
Yeah.
So to me, I think the concept of an environment scope should not be tied to clusters. I don't think they match one-to-one. I don't think they, from an end user app. So when you might have a Git repo that runs a particular end user app that you want to deploy some code, you know, I make sense for environment. You have like a production environment for have you. But from like a cluster management perspective, you know, production is more than one cluster to us, especially for security and compliance reasons where we have different security levels and stuff. So to me, environment scopes are for things that are deployed on top of it. For me managing my clusters, I don't think environment scopes should matter at all. They don't matter to me. I don't really follow that model. I follow, these are the clusters I have that I've added to GitLab, and I want to manage each one of those independently and know what I'm putting on each one. And then if other Git repos under my group want to deploy on top of them, and they can use environment scopes to mark which one of those clusters for their environments that they want to map to, that's fine. But for me as a cluster admin, I need to just understand directly the clusters I have and what I want to install on them. Right.
So environment scope comes at a later stage, if I understand correctly what you're saying. So
it's more managed too. It's more for people deploying, like the auto DevOps and people deploying things on top. But for me, yeah, so I think the thing is, I have multiple clusters that are production. That's really, it's never going to be a one cluster for production for me, because we have security limitations. Some of them have to be PCI compliant. Some of them have to be, you know, SOX compliant. And so what is production for us is never just a one-to-one. We have, you know, it could be 6. And then staging, we might have all of our staging environments running on one cluster, but once again, we may have a few different staging ones as well. So I manage those clusters, and then other people use, you know, GitLab CI and GitLab Auto DevOps deploy on top of that. And what they environment scopes and what they map to is kind of more up to them a little bit. But I just need to know that when I run my managed apps, where I want these apps installed and configured certain ways across those clusters.
And how do you manage at the moment to have multiple clusters per environment?
So it's kind of tricky. So essentially what we do is, so at the moment, right, when I add, so if I have a group, let's say it's like my GitLab engineering group or whatever, and I add like 6 clusters in there, we go into the settings screen for each one, right? And I can click the buttons for each one. And that doesn't matter about environment scopes at all. The current workflow that is in the app has no kind of concept of being mapped to environment scopes at all. I can go into any one of those clusters in the GitLab app, in the GitLab webpage, I can click on Kubernetes clusters, I can click on settings, and then I can click and install all of the, I'm happy to show you my screen as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think
that would probably be okay. So give me
because I was trying to create a cluster and I was using the star environment scope, and I wasn't allowed to create a second cluster under this environment scope. So I'm not really getting how it's not a creation.
Well, maybe look, maybe
you've hacked GitLab.
Let me just have a look. Sorry, let me get the share screen button. I'm not sure why this is not letting me share my screen.
I'm not sure either.
The button to me is grayed out. It could just be my end. Yeah.
Oh, I've stopped sharing, right?
Yeah, it's just not showing. Like the button's there, but it's. Let me just rejoin 1 second and see if I can fix this up.
Okay.
Hi, I'll try again.
Hopefully it works because
As soon as I quit the meeting, it shows me the shared screen button comes back, but it's actually locked out for me. I don't know if it's like, because am I logged in as a guest or something like that? Or is the permissions on the
meeting? Let me pause it.
Yeah, weird. It just disappeared when I don't know. Okay, so if I look at GitLab, and this could also be perhaps, I'm not even saying that I'm doing this correctly as well, to be honest. I could be...
there is no correct way, right? It's your use case and you're trying to solve that.
So here we go. So it could very well be that I think the environment's... See, I think you actually could be right. Like, I don't think necessarily we are at the moment might be... See, I think if you... So basically the workflow we have at the moment is, if I create a new cluster in here, the GitLab managed apps that I want, I'll actually click through and install and configure here. And I know exactly which cluster I'm going on.
Mm-hmm. Because you have the name. So what happens in the CI job? You mean you don't initiate from the cluster page the installation and you have to remember
So at the moment this is the way to do it, but they're changing the new way to do it, which is still being worked on, which is the initial thing I was talking about with Dong, was this cluster management stuff, which is the cluster management repo.
Yeah, what I was the management project, right? And configure the .yaml file for, and there's no linking between, if I understand it correctly, between the management project and the actual cluster. From the UI at least.
No, and I think perhaps, that's kind of a little bit tricky as well, I think. So if I add an existing cluster, so I think, this will probably, so you can't have duplicated environment scope. So the test, so you are correct, actually. So at the moment, we must be splitting them by environment scopes as well. So I think probably the difference there is, just trying to think, we must not even be using the environment scopes in our current setup. Maybe that's why but to us, see, like, so we might have this one cluster that's in production that I guess, I'm not sure, but my understanding is, this could be wrong, that especially with we've been using this to manage our clusters, and some of them are using like GitLab Auto DevOps, and some of them aren't using GitLab Auto DevOps. They're just deploying stuff manually. And I think the thing that maybe this has always been this way. Well, I guess it has always been this way. But I think the thing that really tricked us, or tricked me, was when we were trying to essentially say, we want, you know, like a production cluster, and we want to have different GitLab managed apps deploying to what they think is a production as an environment scope, but they're different clusters. Like, I guess it is basically that limitation of one cluster per environment scope. And I'm just trying to, that to us is becoming trickier for us to work around, or, you know, to basically try and do if we want to move more stuff to GitLab or to DevOps, because we have multiple clusters that are in production. I guess what I could do is, if I put one cluster at the group level, and then if one particular project wants to use a different cluster, I could put a different cluster at the project level. That's potentially a way to do it. But the problem is, once again, is if I want the same cluster management repo for those two clusters, when I run the cluster management job, CI job, I don't know which one it'll actually pick, because they're both of those clusters are in scope production, if that makes sense.
It does. There is a plan that you can reuse a management project. So the MVC is going to be just creating automatically a management project for each cluster. And in the future, you'll be able to select a management project for each cluster. So, which means you probably can reuse.
Well, I can already do that. So I've got like, so if I look under, here, so I can select the same cluster management project multiple times, GitLab Services Cluster Management. And if I actually look at, I guess that's what I want is one repo. Like, I do like the idea of, was that empty? I didn't think that was empty. Okay. Why is that not showing? I must have pushed an empty commit into there. Okay. Yeah, I think this was the tricky part. Was I wanted one cluster management repo, and I wanted to be able to say this cluster management repo can manage, you know, all of the different clusters I had.
Instead of going to each cluster and selecting the management repo.
Yeah, well, that's okay. I can when I create the clusters, I can bind them all to the one management repo. But it was more a case of, I wanted to be able to, I wanted to be able to have multiple clusters that map to production, so that any of the GitLab projects that are using it, you know, can choose which cluster, I guess, that is production or whatever based off their use case. But I also wanted to, I refer to my clusters, you know, by their name or identify. To me, that's what those clusters are. Whereas the CI only knows off environment. A CI knows, like, that's, you know, you set an environment for a CI job, and that's how it knows which cluster to go to. But to me, I want to be able to say, I would like to run it against this cluster or this cluster that's not necessarily tied to environment scope. Or ideally, there's multiple clusters in a production environment scope. And
how would GitLab know? So since in the deployment phase, you specify the environment rather than the cluster. Do you see any, so if you have multiple clusters per environment?
Yes.
Yeah, how's the deployment going to happen? Does it matter which cluster you deploy to if they're both in production?
It does, and that is a tricky setup, because it would essentially mean you would at some level have to pick, like, you know, it would be like, there's multiple clusters in this environment scope. How do you, you know, pick which one to actually apply it to? The one thing I haven't really looked at, and maybe thinking about it now might be worth exploring, is I know we can do wildcard environment scopes, and I could maybe start seeing if I can make a wildcard or make a scope like production / something, and then production / something different, and try and see they're still different environment scopes, but at least I can see them under, you know, production, like they're product namespace under production, but they're different environment scopes. But what I think the tricky part there is, I don't know how GitLab Auto DevOps works if you don't use the standard staging production environment scopes. If you have different custom environment scopes, I'm not sure how the Auto DevOps stuff works and picks that up. But maybe that's the only missing piece. Maybe if sorry, I'm just kind of thinking out loud. Maybe if I namespace off production, the different scopes, and then one cluster under there. And then if Auto DevOps is still able to work with that, like I can say somehow, this is the scope I want, this whole Auto DevOps workflow, I want it to use, this production scope. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that gets me what I want and it'll all work. But I think that's the tricky part at the moment is, at least from what I can tell, we've had to actually create entirely different groups with different clusters so that they don't overwrite so that each one can have its own production scope and production cluster, if that makes sense.
Yes, for Auto DevOps, you mean still?
Yeah, yes. Because I think we've got GitLab services for one, and I think we have, can't remember, there was so just find GitLab.
I'm not sure either, because when you turn on Auto DevOps, if you have multiple environments, how do Auto DevOps use the environment scopes?
Right.
How do they know which environment scope they're going to deploy to? Does it have to be production?
I think it's based off, like, I think so, but once again, I haven't had a close look at it. So that's also, I think the production, like master branch in Git maps to production. Like that's, I think, a hard mapping, or at least I think that's expected. I could be wrong. I don't know. And if I'm wrong, it's definitely, I just haven't looked at the documentation well enough, or it's not clear. But I think that would be okay. If I was confident that if we kept with the one cluster to an environment scope, that would be okay, as long as then my end users on top of that were not forced to just the production, like if they could fully control the scopes that they were using, I guess.
Yeah. I would like to ask you to describe your workflow. So when do you create infrastructure, and
Sure.
who reaches to you to, or do you have planned projects? How do you actually configure the infrastructure?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the big thing we do is a lot of these, so obviously we'll get a request to deploy a new app, or, just to migrate an existing app off old infrastructure to Kubernetes and things like that. So we use Terraform to spin up our GKE clusters. So we have a Git repo where we commit Terraform code, and that launches a CI job to run Terraform itself. And that does things like creates the Google project, creates all of the basic cloud components needed. So like the virtual network, any other bits and pieces we need, and then actually creates the GKE Kubernetes cluster. And there's also, sorry.
How do you specify the Terraform? So we're working on a Terraform integration now.
Sure.
But at the moment, how do you do it? Do you do it through a project?
Yes, so this link here, you should have access to. Let me see if I can drop it in the chat. Okay, just gonna let me chat. I'll drop it in actually.
Slack, yeah.
Yeah, cool. So this project essentially runs it's basically got some CI jobs that will create everything. I can step through this, but it's, it's quite a lot in there. But essentially, if I look at the actual, what a pipeline looks like, it'll essentially see, so it does like it's probably a bit too small for you to read, but it does like a validate, then it does a Terraform plan, and then it basically does the Terraform apply. And then there might be some extra bits we need on the end of it that will do bits and pieces. We also use the GitLab Terraform module.
Oh, you already use it?
Yep. In fact, we made some additions to it to actually improve some of the Kubernetes integration stuff. And there's some more work I want to do on that, actually. I want to do some more work on that Terraform module to do the GitLab managed apps stuff as well, like that we're talking about now, because it's currently not supported.
I'll be working on the Terraform user experience, and I would love to hear how you would expect the actual flow to happen in GitLab once we have. So how do you expect to start the Terraform project, and how would you expect to link it to clusters if that's a
so that's so if I look in here, so basically in the Terraform, one of the things we do in Terraform is, obviously, as I said, we create all the cloud resources, and then once they're all created, we use the GitLab provider to actually do a GitLab group project.
So you first manually create the resources, the clusters?
No, they're done by a pipeline in this Terraform. So this pipeline will do it. So if I have a look at, let's see if I can find one for myself here. Let me have a look at. So we actually have all our Terraform code in this Git repository. And then when we like push a branch or run a CI pipeline, this does a Terraform apply. And that a Terraform apply sets up the networking, creates a subnetwork. This makes the actual GKE container cluster, which takes a long time, takes like 6 minutes. And then that sets everything up. And so, excuse me. I think this, that's a warning. So this kind of sets it all up. And then as part of this Terraform code as well, one of the things that I'm working on right now is to automate adding it to GitLab. So once the cluster's all created and it's running, the Kubernetes cluster, normally we would go into GitLab via the web UI and we'd add the cluster, and I'd cut and paste all the information and everything. But using this GitLab group cluster, which just got added recently, which we pushed upstream, now we basically, in the Terraform code as well, when we create the cluster, we can also specify, hey, add it to GitLab. And so it'll appear in GitLab in the UI straight away.
Oh, okay.
And you can see here we specify the environment scope and everything else. So it literally is, as soon as you click a button to run the pipeline, the cluster's created, it's added to GitLab, and someone can deploy on top of it straight away.
And how do the developers developing an application know which cluster they're going to use? How do you communicate that?
So this is the tricky part. At the moment, because we only have the one cluster per production cluster scope, everyone's actual app code lives in a different group. They're very separated, and we have to constantly hunt around from time to time. And if there is a cluster we want to share across two groups, it's tricky. Like, that's really overall what I'm trying to kind of improve somehow, is if we can bring it back to every single cluster we have inside of one group, and then all of our application, our users code also in that one group. But then we're able to, just using Auto DevOps, get more fine-grained control over which clusters are going to be used by which Auto DevOps processes and so forth. And I think I've been looking at it from trying to remove the cluster management side, but perhaps this is just more of an Auto DevOps configuration side. I'm not sure. Because I could definitely see, now that I think about it, going back and trying to namespace the environment scopes for the production clusters a bit better, and then maybe seeing if that works. But yeah, it's really how the Auto DevOps workflow would work with that. Right. So what I've also done as part of Terraform as well is, after the cluster's added to GitLab, someone would still need to go into the UI and click the install buttons for all the apps. So for so if I look at, so it would show up here automatically. It would come up as soon as Terraform finished. It would appear here without any intervention. And then I'd have to go on here, and I'd have to like, I'd click all these buttons. I'd click these. And so what I've done is I've actually automated that via Terraform as well. If I can find it. You'll have to forgive me. I'm just, So this is probably in... Trying to find it myself. It's been a while since I've actually had a look at this.
Yeah. We're a bit over time already. If you don't mind continuing.
Sure. No, that's okay. You know, it's fine. Essentially what I've done is I've written a script which will automate clicking those buttons. And if you're interested in how it works and ever, I can send you a link to the code. I'm pretty sure it's up in GitLab somewhere.
That would be. So with Terraform and the management project, do you envision using Terraform within the management? So there is a discussion about combining Terraform and the cluster management project.
So possibly, if the cluster management project, I'm not against using Terraform inside it. Ideally, we'd probably want to move to using Crossplane eventually to do the actual spinning up of the cluster as well. But that might be a little bit harder to do straight away. But essentially, what we're doing in this Git repo with the Terraform probably makes sense to come into a cluster management project as well. If it scopes out so that the cluster management project could create the cluster, add it to GitLab like we're currently doing, and then also run like the CI jobs for the GitLab managed apps via CI to install those on top and configure them, you know, like all these Prometheus, GitLab runner, Crossplane, cert managing, whatever we need. I could, you know, say, okay, this is the cluster I want. These are the apps I want installed on top of it. This is the settings I want. I mean, that would be great. That would be, you know, more or less what we're doing here, but just, you know, if it was combined in a bit later, you know, bit of a better user interface in the GitLab product around that, you know, that's something we'd be very interested in.
So how do you envision the better interface?
Good question. Excuse me. I'd have to have a bit of a think about it, but I think the question really comes down to possibly when you click add a Kubernetes cluster here. I mean, we have these kind of screens where you can add an existing cluster, create a new cluster, and we've got these two kind of options. But I would almost envision like, perhaps you have another button or something here that's like a GitLab, you know, perhaps either the word custom or a GitOps backed repository or a GitOps backed provisioner, or maybe that's the word, but like a custom provisioner where you can basically, you know, have access to creating your own Terraform code or some kind of custom provisioning around that.
That's very interesting. So initiate the Terraform project from here, from the cluster page.
Yeah, possibly. Another way I could see it done, and perhaps this is also a good way of looking at it, is if I have a cluster management repo already, I would love to be able to just commit a new file to that repo and say, actually, I would like to create a new cluster. Here is the settings. Commit that to Git. And then, you know, when I commit that to Git, it kicks off a pipeline to run Terraform, creates a cluster, adds it to GitLab, installs the apps and everything. So that is really a more GitOps workflow, which I also think would actually be incredibly valuable. You get a bit of the chicken and the egg problem. I don't know how you would set up a cluster management project without a cluster already. I'm not sure. Maybe that isn't too difficult. But that is also another way, which is how we currently do it, more or less. Like whenever we push a new branch, it creates a new cluster, or whenever we push a commit to master, we can define creating a new cluster. And that's the real true GitOps workflow. And honestly, that's probably the most ideal one.
Okay, so for the workflow you're using currently, that would make sense.
Yes.
Okay, that's very interesting.
But yeah, I would be interested to understand, you know, when I create a new group, does that mean I can click a button and get a cluster management repo already? That's a pretty cool idea. Like I think that would work well if you like, okay, I create a group, here's a cluster management repo for you. You can push, you know, I push a file to it saying, create me a cluster. This is how I want it to look. And these are the settings. And then it just comes up and, you know, it's added, and that would be great, I think.
Okay. Well, cool. So another question I have is, how do you experience the clusters on different levels? So we have the ability to create clusters on 3 levels. What do you think about this experience?
Yeah, we haven't done much yet, mostly because we have been, we're still playing around with this quite early. The instance-wide So because also we use gitlab.com and ops.gitlab.net to manage our deployments of and management of Kubernetes clusters and stuff. Because we're using gitlab.com, we can't have instance-wide clusters because that means every user of gitlab.com would have access to it, which is obviously not what we want. So we don't touch instance-wide clusters at all. We always scope them to groups or projects.
Right.
And as I mentioned before, basically, because a lot of the stuff we're using auto DevOps and we're not quite sure how that works with custom environment scopes or not the standard environment scopes of production and what have you, we have more or less gone down to creating new groups creating a new group, putting some clusters in there for staging and production, create another new group, staging production. And they're very separated and we often have to duplicate permissions and stuff across.
Oh.
But that's kind of how we're doing it at the moment. And we don't really use project clusters very much because most of the clusters, not always, but most of the clusters we would like to have them managed at the one level. Because it's hard for us to go, oh, well, where is a cluster? Is it in this project or this project, or is it in this group? If we keep them all at least at the group level, we know there's a few different groups we can look at to find where that cluster is.
I see.
But I'm not against putting them at the project level. I think the tricky part is in the GitLab UI, if I'm in a group, like I might be an admin of this group, I can't at a glance see what cluster is in every single there's no tree. There's no way for me to look top down and see everything. What's the clusters in my instance? What are the clusters that are in my groups? What are the clusters that are in my projects? All in one view.
Yes.
So for someone who's trying to manage that and make sure that, that the security of those clusters and what version they're running and everything, it's really hard for me to get a picture of that easily.
That's very interesting for me because it was I had the same thought that you cannot really have inspect your complete infrastructure in one place. Could you have more infrastructure? So not just Kubernetes clusters, but other type of infrastructure that you would like to have overview with?
Yeah, so I think especially with us doing more work with cross-plane, I think there's potential there for us to get a full view of all our cloud resources. Or Terraform is the same, I guess, cross-plane or Terraform, but it is interesting. So if we might create a Kubernetes cluster, but we also might create a cloud database instance, a cloud SQL instance, right? For some data storage as part of that app running on that cluster. It might need some data storage. It might have some other bits and pieces. If we're creating them more in Terraform, it would be nice to be able to get a view, like a visual or representation, or just an overview of that infrastructure that was created by Terraform in those CI jobs, which often is just stored in the Terraform state file. So Terraform will just store a state file saying, these are the objects I created, and this is where they live, or some details about them. Right. So being able to, especially if you're running Terraform from the cluster management, is not only being able to just, run Terraform, create some things, but then at a holistic view, take a step back and go, okay, well, what has this Terraform, if I've run this cluster management project for me, is now, it's made all these things. What's a clear view of everything that it's done so that I can understand, what am I doing and what are other people in my group doing, and what is the infrastructure we now have running on this, this account or this cloud provider or what have you.
Right. So just to verify I got it right, Terraform returns a plan before you actually deploy the Terraform code, but then after you deploy you of that plan, so what it has done, not just to verify the plan, but also after it actually runs.
Yeah, so I think the plan will tell you, what it's going to do and what it's going to change. And if you run it again, the plan will be empty because everything's already created. It's the actual Terraform state file and where you store that. That is a running list of what it currently manages and has created. And I think that state file is the most interesting part.
Right.
Because that is the current state of what is running and is managed.
That's very interesting. Okay. If I can ask one more question. Okay, please go on. You were about to.
Oh, the state file is just a JSON, typically just a JSON file
That
that's
could be
stored either
parsed.
locally or more than likely is stored in like a cloud bucket or something. It depends on the configuration, but it's fairly easy to find.
Right, and I guess it could be parsed to then present the information in a nice way in the UI.
Sure.
Okay. So if we go back to the list of clusters, I was wondering what kind of information you would like to see in this view for each cluster, and if, yeah, it would be useful to see more.
It would be useful at a very high level, and I understand the more information we put on this page, the longer it will take to load. So obviously, I understand we kind of got to be careful, but I think some very good high level pieces like maybe even just the API URL, so the URL to hit the Kubernetes endpoint would probably be useful. I think maybe the Kubernetes version it's running is also very useful. It's very nice. It'd be very nice to see at a glance, oh, look, my staging environment is, or my production environment is running a different version from my other environments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the API URL would be nice because, you know, at the moment I'm like, what's this cluster again? How do I access this cluster? I have to click on here and then I find
Yeah, it's at the bottom. You also have to click expand in the details.
I think if it's got a cluster management project, if it's being managed by cluster management, I think that would also be nice to see on the screen. And perhaps even some of these settings, like if it's a GitLab managed cluster, I think would also be, whoops, we'll click save on that. That would also be nice to see at a glance. So I could see, you know, what clusters are here, what clusters are actually managed by GitLab, maybe what version of Kubernetes they're running. And it would also probably be good. And once again, I don't want to overload the screen, but being able to see what GitLab managed apps are installed quickly. So if I could see like somewhere over here that it's like, okay, like there's a little symbol for Helm, the Ingress Nginx, Jupyter Hub, like just a few symbols of what apps are installed on it. Though I do understand that's going to grow quite a lot. So I don't know if that's going to be feasible to do, but I think that would also be useful. So I could look and see, okay, these are the clusters I have. What am I installing and managing on them? You know, what version are they kind of running?
Yes, that's very interesting. If I can, it's very interesting information you're giving me. Okay, if I can share my screen for a second.
Sure, I'll just try and stop this.
I think I can take over. I'll try. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen?
Sure.
Okay, so I've done a redesign for the listing.
Ah, there you go.
So yeah, I haven't, yeah, this is maybe not the most final one. So if you can bear with me. Okay, this is the most final one. Okay, so in my understanding, you don't really care about the cluster size and the total memory. And
look, that's interesting to know. I think definitely that where you've got the amount free, like the resource contention, I think is useful, is definitely useful. I'm very interested to know if I'm starting to get the, you know, contention levels of my cluster are getting full. Absolutely.
Okay, I had a developer persona in my mind when designing that, in case they have their project level clusters and they want to deploy to, but I'm not sure it's a valid use case. I'm kind of making assumptions. Okay.
I think the resource contention, like total cores, total memory and stuff is useful. I'm not sure if the cluster size is necessarily useful to me.
Okay.
Just simply because, especially the way I think and use Kubernetes is, you know, I try not, of course I have physical, you know, real nodes that I'm worried about, but it really is more of a, like how much resources. I try and think in a more abstract sense.
Right.
So I definitely want to know, you know, if I'm hitting thresholds of running out of memory or running out of CPU, but the cluster size, not so much.
Would that be useful in the screen? So to warn you, you're running out of resources on this cluster.
I think the thing with resources you have to be careful of, getting into the technical nitty-gritty of Kubernetes, there's two actual ways to look at contention and resource allocation in Kubernetes. When you create the pods and you create the resources in Kubernetes, you can tell it how much to give. So you can say, this pod only needs a gig of memory. That's all it gets. That's all it gives it, and away it goes. And the scheduler knows how to go, okay, I can find a node with 1 gig free memory. What happens a lot, and I think our auto DevOps apps do this a lot as well, is they don't tell any limits. They say, this app can use as much as it wants, go for it.
Right.
There's two problems with that. One, the Kubernetes scheduler has to make what it's called as a best effort guess on where to fit it, because it's like, I don't know how much it's going to use. So I'm just going to try and put it here. And if it uses too much memory or CPU, it will kill the pod and actually kill your application. Because it goes, you didn't tell me how much I'm going to use. I gave you, I put you here, you're using too much and I'm running out of memory, I will kill you.
Instead of auto-scaling, so you cannot, I thought it was auto-scaling in these cases. So instead it's killing the pod?
So if a particular physical node in Kubernetes is hitting its memory limit, the kubelet, which is the piece of software that runs on that node that's talking to Kubernetes control plane and managing the pods, will look at all of the apps that are running on there. And if it finds an app that has it was never given any information about how much memory or CPU it was allowed to use, it was just left to best effort, it will go, you're a best effort pod, I'm running out of memory, I need to get some memory back, you never told me how much memory you were going to use, I'm going to just kill you.
Wow.
And often that would means it will get rescheduled on another node, but if you're close to cluster capacity, it will just, it'll get rescheduled often on the same node, it'll start using more memory again and get killed again.
Right.
So it's really actually best practice in general. Every pod, you should always tell Kubernetes how much memory and CPU to give it. And Kubernetes will limit that, like it won't allow it to use any more than that, but it also allows it to make good decisions, because it can go, okay, this box has 6 gig of memory free. You've given me a pod that says it can only use 3 gig. I can definitely run it on that box, and I definitely know it's not going to use more than that. So I definitely know that I've got this much free.
Does the developer do that when they deploy the application, or does the...
They should, but it's not always the case if people do or not. And it's something I've raised just because when you're talking about total memory and total cores, if you report, you've got to be careful, because if you report what's currently being used, that's not necessarily it cannot necessarily be an accurate representation. This is a topic actually I can go into in quite detail, having done a lot of it in the past, but all I'm just saying is it's good for me to know this information. I would actually enhance it to say more of the total resources that so the amount of CPU or memory that's currently being used is this amount, but the actual amount of CPU and resources that, if you add up pods, and for every pod that's defined limits on what it's allowed to use, both of those statistics are important to me. I want to know what, have people defined and said their pods are going to use. But if I'm using, if people have said, their pods are going to use like 10 gig of memory in total, but the currently there's like 20 gig being used, I might actually find some pods and say, hey, look, I found this pod, you haven't set memory limits on this pod. So, we're using, I don't know, like this is using X amount of memory, and like,
I see.
It's harder for me to make a very clear, and even these statistics you provide will not be a clear picture unless you're looking at both values and understanding kind of the differences between what's going on. And that's just kind of a Kubernetes implementation detail. I
see. Okay. So if the developer doesn't define those limits, then what would a good user experience be? So your job, I guess, is to ensure the infrastructure is covering the needs of the application. So what would be a crisis solution in this case when an application is about to be killed because the developer didn't set the limits?
Yeah, so that's good. So there's two ways to look at that. I can definitely spin up more nodes to take, like, if it's like, you know what, because sometimes obviously fixing these things and investigating them can take time. So I can certainly go, you know what, I'm going to just spin up extra capacity to handle that. You know, I'll spin up more nodes. I'll expand my cluster to take that on. And then in the meantime, we'll go and investigate, see if we can figure out understanding what the needs of that pods are and lock that down definitively. And then, you know, either scale down the cluster, or maybe the cluster needs to stay that big, but we're just making sure that we, you know, understand the use case. That's probably more often than not, that might be the quickest solution. The other solution, because I guess if a pod is being killed, chances are, unless it's like there's a bug in the application or something, it actually needs to use that memory. So the difference is if a pod just naturally grows in memory usage and, you know, causes the box to run out of memory, it will get killed simply because Kubernetes didn't get told how much memory it needs. But it may need that much memory. It could be time for me to actually expand the cluster. But it's that not sure. And especially in the case of misbehaving applications, and we do see it from time to time where an application just is leaking memory. And in which case, if an application is leaking memory and it's got hard limits set on the amount of memory it can use, it will still die. But at least we know, I mean, at least we can then know that, you know, it's not just dying because, you know, we can definitively say, well, this is the amount of memory we think it should use. And if it's dying because it's running out of memory, that's a problem. Especially if it's like a new version of an app and it's like all of a sudden it starts dying because it's using more memory, we can kind of
roll back to the previous.
Yeah.
And how do you get notified about a cluster running out of resources? Do you get notified?
Yeah, so we're using Prometheus monitoring, which is set up into our monitoring infrastructure to monitor basically how much cluster resources we're using overall. And so at the moment, because it is basically when we get the alert and the cluster is running out of resources, we have to kind of make a bit of a judgment call. We don't get much visibility into, like we can see how much the cluster is using, but you know, we have to kind of still do a lot of manual investigation into
why.
Yeah, why? Like, is this a misbehaving app? Is it like a user, you know, we're running GitLab.com services in Kubernetes. Is it someone outside of GitLab trying to do bad stuff or doing the wrong thing? Or is this just the app just needs more resources? Maybe it just needs more resources because it's, you know, got more features or something.
Right. So you do get notified, but do you use the monitoring within GitLab, or do you use
Not yet, but we basically, we don't at the moment, but we are talking to the monitoring team about trying to use that more, especially for the auto DevOps stuff.
And if I may ask one more question, and I will let you go.
No worries.
Regarding the monitoring, do I have any? I don't think I have a cluster here, but I was wondering, where do you expect to see monitoring? Oh, wait, maybe here. Okay, I do have a cluster somewhere here.
Yeah, look, it's
I cannot find it. Sorry.
I think, oh, you're right. I think, definitely, I think on the kind of cluster management details, I think it'd be not, I think we already do see bits and pieces of the monitoring there. I think there is a monitoring, I have to admit, I haven't actually done much with the monitoring of the monitoring part of GitLab at all. I'm not very familiar with it, so I may not be the best one to answer. But I do think, you know, being able to identify, I think there's two ways, right? Like being able to look at a particular cluster and monitoring that cluster. And then once again, even if there's like a pane on the left-hand side of the screen that's for monitoring where I get a more bird's eye view over all my clusters and all my infrastructure, that would also kind of be nice or quite useful as well, I think.
Right. It's very to have a follow-up in case we initiate a dashboard, is what I'm hearing. For your infrastructure, both monitoring and also kind of overview. Okay, and I'm pretty sure the product manager for the system group will be interested to talk to you if there is because he's working on Terraform.
Okay.
the next steps. So would it be okay if I refer him?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always happy to talk to anyone.
That's perfect. It was super interesting, our conversation today.